Welcome everyone to the Denver World Trade Center Day 2020. I'm joining you virtually from Singapore, other side of the world. It's a reflection, I suppose, of how connected we all remain despite the extraordinary circumstances. I'm very pleased to be with you to talk about this very important subject, and I hope that you carry forward the momentum of this conversation and the rest of them throughout not only this World Trade Month, but also through the coming months and years as you place Denver at the center of global trade networks. And that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about today with this topic of the cities of the future. And now we've added, of course, this suffix, if you will, in a post-pandemic world. So let's first talk about global supply chains, which are really always shifting, and we're witnessing this now very much in real time. Let's remember one very important thing, which is that whether or not there's a pandemic, whether or not there's a trade war going on, supply chains are always shifting. They're always seeking the path of least resistance. Supply chains are literally like water flowing down a mountain. There are many causes of supply chain shifting. Here are some important ones to think about. One is the cost of labor. Right now, we're seeing labor costs lower in Southeast Asia than in China. So going back about 10 years, a lot of production started to shift towards Southeast Asia. And that predates the trade war, it predates the pandemic. Another factor is industrial policy. Countries saying, if you want to sell to us, you have to make your products here. That's, of course, what China has been doing since roughly 1980. And yet, despite all of those restrictions and regulations, you can clearly see from this graphic that the supply chain of almost everything is truly global. And it takes a disruption like a trade war or a pandemic to remind us just how global everything is, and we take it for granted. So look at, the red lines show you an Apple iPhone. As we know, designed in Cupertino, made in China. You can see the red lines right there. But there are components and parts that come from Europe as well. Whether a laptop like one made by Dell or Acer or something like that, a pair of Levi's jeans, pharmaceutical products. There's a great one that's in the news right now, obviously, where we see that medical supplies have largely concentrated in countries that are able to produce generic medications at very low cost, largely in places like Asia. So, and of course, automobiles as well, where the components, the car parts come from everywhere, they're assembled everywhere. So right now, we truly have these globally distributed supply chains. And the question that we have to ask is, are we going to see a shift in those patterns as a result of either the pandemic or other things that have been accumulating, like the trade war? And the answer is yes and no. If you think about right now, you've probably heard this phrase, the internet is creaking at the seams. That's a reminder that digital supply chains are every bit as important as putting stuff in containers and putting them on ships and sailing them across the oceans. And so clearly, if Netflix and Spotify and others, like YouTube, have to slow their resolution or streaming speed around the world, that's a sign that we actually have a massive global exchange of information that is extremely valuable. And the value of that global services trade is catching up to the value of global goods trade. Now let's talk about what may happen with goods trade. And this is the next slide where I talk about global longitudinal regions. That's a fancy way of saying that the world is in fact regionalizing in many ways and has been actually kind of under the radar. And that applies in some quite critical areas. Now, food. We clearly have global food distribution, global energy supply chains as well, and we have a global movement of labor and obviously global capital mobility and movement of international finance currencies and so forth. But what is also happening is that in certain key areas of supply chains, of services, goods, commodities, there's a lot of regionalization. Just think of energy. North America has had the shale energy revolution over the last 15, 20 years, and that has meant that it needs to import far less energy from the Middle East. The same is actually true of East Asia, the oval on the right-hand side, Asia more broadly. Asia is discovering that it can draw on natural gas from Russia, from Australia, and even though it is the largest consumer of energy from the Middle Eastern countries, right at the seam there between the European, African sort of vertical and the Asian one, it needs that less and less. So depending on what supply chain we're talking about, we could see a retrenchment and a regionalism. Now, if you think about the role of protectionism and also labor automation and cheap energy, if you take those three factors together, protectionism, cheap energy, and labor automation, it does become increasingly cost competitive to shore. We've been hearing a lot about nearshoring into North America really since the mid 2010s. It hasn't really happened as much as it could, but I think that the acceleration of labor automation will probably make that increasingly true. The bottom line is that we're actually moving towards a world where you quote unquote make where you sell. And that actually is quite favorable for North America, provided that North America itself integrates further and represents an even larger market than just the United States alone, and draws on the natural resources of Canada and Mexico. And I'll get into that shortly. Let's talk about this regionalism, region by region. And I'll come around to North America after explaining some of the regions that are doing this very rapidly in other parts of the world. We'll start with Europe, because really that's where the story begins in terms of a region that has been the most advanced in integrating internally. For example, 70% of European trade is within the European Union. That's something that British people found out the hard way after they voted for Brexit in the year 2016. Suddenly they were Googling, what is the European Union? And they realized that the vast majority of the trade is with the European Union, so why have they just gone and created artificial barriers towards a relationship that benefits them so much? And they're still wondering why they did that to some degree, even though they're obviously going to do it anyway. So devolution-aggregation, what does that mean? Well, Europe is a lot of countries, and within those countries you have semi-autonomous regions, even separatist movements, new borders going up and so forth. But at the same time, you also see them deepening their integration in a range of ways. For example, obviously sharing a currency, as many of them do, lowering trade restrictions, lowering migration restrictions. And some of these have decreased or have increased rather. Barriers have gone up. The Schengen Agreement right now has obviously been frozen to prohibit migration between areas that are virus hotspots. But in the end, they return to the pattern of deepening their integration. Right now, they're facing a test, for example, about whether or not to create a common currency or a corporate bond, a backstop for all of the companies that are going to be affected by the slowdown in business from the pandemic. Also, the European Union and NATO, in fact, continue to expand. So you can see there in the lower or in the middle right portion is the Balkan countries. One by one, they're all joining the European Union as well. So this is a political map. It shows you the borders between European countries. But this now, what you're seeing is a functional map. Here I'm showing you Europe's oil and gas energy group. This is a very important role model for North America and other regions, because here, if you blend out the political borders and you show the oil and the gas pipelines, here's what you see. You see that Europe is basically an egg that cannot be unscrambled. They totally depend on each other for energy. A lot of countries in Europe don't even know where their energy comes from, but they certainly don't struggle to get it. It turns out, for example, that when Germany decided after the Fukushima nuclear incident of 2011 that it was going to shut down its nuclear power industry, it wound up actually importing nuclear power from France, right? So this is a completely integrated energy grid, and that's a good thing for their resilience, right? It diminishes the dependence on Russia or other volatile providers of energy. Also, their investments in renewables are critical towards pushing them towards greater self-sufficiency. So I'm an advocate of thinking regionally and cross-border in terms of supply chain relations, energy relations. Remember that economics fundamentally is not about countries as units. It is actually about supply chains. It is about optimizing it's about optimizing land, labor, and capital distribution across geography. And that's up to us to do as countries. And Europe, again, has done a very good job of this despite the obstacles that they face right now. Now, let's bring in another variable that's extremely important, cities, right? We've talked about economics, supply chains, regional geographies, but the drivers of our economies fundamentally are cities, because people have been moving to cities. 60% of the world population lives in cities. As you can see here, this is a demographic heat map. It's the entire world's population. All of the 8 billion of us is a pixel on this map. And yellow are the most dense regions, going down through orange, pink, purple, and so forth. And you can see the majority of the world population is in Asia. And there's about 45 or so ovals, these dashed ovals that I've sketched out. Those show you the megacity clusters, right? The largest concentrations of people. So you can see that, for example, in the United States, what we sometimes call the Boss-Wash corridor, Boston, New York to Washington. In the West Coast, it's kind of LA, San Francisco. It's obviously not one city, but it is an urban corridor or an urbanizing corridor. In the Western Hemisphere, actually, Sao Paulo and Mexico City are the two largest by population. You have Nairobi, Mumbai, and Pune. Obviously, in East Asia, Jakarta, Manila. The Pearl River Delta, which in China they now call the Greater Bay Area, is now the largest city in the world, the largest urban agglomeration in the world. Just to put it in perspective, again, that's 60 plus million people. So it's overtaken Tokyo. In the Western world, Europe, North America, our largest cities are like 10 to 15 million people. We're talking about 60 or so million people in Asia. So cities are the locus of the world population, the economic activity, innovation as well. And how cities relate to each other across borders is critical to building up strong regional economies. Each of these cities, in some ways, is not just the key economic center of their country, right? They can be at a global level and really certainly at a regional level, capitals as well. And that's, of course, the way I would urge you to think about the role of your city, not just national, but really regional, and what are your global connections and global supply chains. Let me cover Asia now. In this rectangle, there's something particular that I want everyone to remember. This is about 60% of the human population lives inside this rectangle. And not only is that true right now as we speak, it's going to be true for the rest of our lives and our children's lives and grandchildren's lives. So this is clearly a region where the action want to be outsourcing to Asia, drawing talent from Asia, whatever the case may be. But remember that this is really the center of global geopolitics and certainly demographics. And it's also now the center of global infrastructure investment. What I'm showing you here is a map of the emerging new Silk Roads, the infrastructure corridors that are being built through investments through China's Belt and Road Initiative, financed by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and others. And you have railways, oil and gas pipelines, internet cables, highways, and so forth, even hydrological canals. All of this, again, optimization of geography across 40 countries, nearly 5 billion or so people. And this is helping to make Asia a whole greater than the sum of its parts. Now, on this map, you have enormous rivalries. Every scenario you can think of for World War III is here on this map. It's Iran, it's Kashmir, it is North Korea, Taiwan, the tensions between India and China, China and Japan, South China Sea. All of the conflict scenarios are on this map, and yet they are investing so much of their resources and energy into building this connectivity to optimize this geography. So again, it's a lesson that's being learned all over the world, even in developing countries. Just a reminder again that China is in purchasing power parity terms already the world's largest economy, even coming out of the crisis. It still is maintaining a decent growth rate. We'll see what happens to the others, but they have been helping each other by trading more with each other despite the competition among them. Now let's get into the heart of the matter here, North America. And of course, I've got Denver right there, right towards the middle along that blue line. Now, here I'm emphasizing the same principles because these are global principles. To think in terms of geology, topography, regionalism, resource optimization, not strictly nationality. I'm going to demonstrate this point through a number of examples here. I call this slide from NAFTA to the North American Union. Of course, North American Union is not a term that is perhaps in favor right now in Washington, and yet you can see that that's sort of what's happening anyway. So let's go back to the pre-pandemic world, if we can remember back that far, and even around the time the trade war began in 2016, 2017, Mexico and Canada are each America's largest trading partners, right? More than $300 billion each. And because of the trade war, there was a point in time last year where trade with China fell to below $300 billion, about $270 billion. Meanwhile, trade with the European Union is close to $1 trillion a year. So we have already become something like a North American Union, even though NAFTA has been talked about like a four-letter word, but the new U.S. Mexico-Canada trade agreement is effectively a NAFTA plus, you might call And now I think we're appreciating more and more, again, when we think in terms of resource sharing, the role that Mexico's young population, industrious population, supply chain shifts and investment into Mexico play in terms of keeping the cost of automotive production down. U.S. investments into Mexico's energy sector, obviously drawing on Mexican labor supply in a wide range of sectors, especially agriculture. Right now, we see how important that is. Canada is a natural resource superpower at a time when immigration to the United States is slowing down. Immigration into Canada is very, very high. In 2018, Canada actually had more net inward migration than the United States did, 350,000 people to our 250,000 people. So many American companies are now getting more technology outsourcing work done in Canada. If you look at some of the yellow lines in the upper right, that is showing you electricity grids. So increasingly, we will find that we may be drawing on Canadian hydropower. For example, obviously, there's already a lot of exchange in energy. You can see the existing and proposed pipelines there. Canada is also working on east-west pipelines that will help to expand energy exports to Asia. It's something that the U.S. needs to, in some ways, catch up and do. So again, thinking in geological terms and thinking about optimizing this, I obviously see cities like Denver in a very propitious position. One of the things I'm looking at is if you take into account economic competition, migration issues, shifting political winds, demographics, and adaptation to climate change, I'm looking at what cities in the world and within each region are going to be the most suited in a way to coping with again, the shifting economic conditions and environmental conditions. And I like to put this in kind of layman's terms. I'm looking for places that have the best latitude, which of course Denver has, the best altitude, which of course is a distinct competitive advantage of Denver, and attitude, which is the right policies that are attracting people, young people especially, and that are business friendly. So already you can say that Denver is doing a lot of the right things. It has the right latitude, altitude, and attitude. And if we think about, for better or worse, the rising unemployment out of the pandemic, the fact that a lot of people are going to be looking for places to go, places where they can afford to live, places where jobs are being created, places where infrastructure is being built, where there's a liberal social culture, it's going to be very important to compete in a way. Even within our country, we have to remember that cities and states compete with each other to attract investment, to be the most business friendly. It happens all the time. Right? And when it comes to domestic investment allocation, we are actually, you could say 48, lower 48 competing states. And within that, there's, I'll show you as well here, there are competing city regions, if you will. Well, here what you see is, some of the trends in terms of migration in the United States. And a lot of this may indeed change, of course, given what's happening right now. But places that are urbanizing quickly are going to, of course, generate more jobs in the services sector. They're going to attract more investment. They're going to have higher growth rates, right? So the ability to attract people who are moving is a very important form of economic stimulus in and of itself. We do have to think about sustainability issues, and I want to come back to that in just a minute. But here I wanted to show you that if you rethink the United States, not in terms of the 50 administrative states such as we know them, but rather think about mapping in terms of functional geography, right, or connective geography. You can look at three trends. You can look at just consumer spending, commuter patterns of geography, and telephone call transactions. And the map on the lower right is what you would get, which is a United States that isn't necessarily 50 distinct administrative states, but is more like 40 really key urban clusters. And those 40 need to be connected with each other to strengthen the nation as a whole, but they also compete with each other, obviously, for talent, for jobs, and for investment. The model that I like to sort of propose, and this comes from the Connectography book, is the United City-States of America. Let's think again beyond the administrative states and think about the urban geographies. And what you see here is that the US has these natural regions, right? These environmental regions, ecological regions, if you will, Pacific Coast, Inland West, Great Plains, Great Lakes, the Northeast, the Southeast, Piedmont Atlantic, Gulf Coast, and so forth. And then you've got the key, again, those same 40, 50 key urban hubs. So you can see with Denver, Colorado Springs, and Albuquerque, this is a population belt of the Front Range. What I've superimposed, and by the way, the white patches are the key demographic centers, right? So you've got the natural geographies in the different colors. White is the population centers. You've got the key cities labeled there. And the gray lines is the connectivity that we need to have to really have a network nation, an infrastructurally networked nation, whether it's airports, whether it's railways. We need to allow people to circulate so that all of our economies benefit. Now, this is the difference between America and any other country in the world. You know, most countries, especially emerging markets, have just one city or two cities that are their economic anchors. In the United States, we have about 40 or 45 really important economic engines. That is truly the difference, one of the main, most significant economic and functional differences between America and any other country in the world. Think about it, the height of the Cold War and with the Soviet Union, how many great economic engines did the Soviet Union ever have? Exactly one, right? China today is really trying. China has about 24 major urban clusters for 1.5 billion people, and they've tried very hard to do this administrative reorganization. So we have to really think about the strength of every one of these key urban hubs in order to ensure America's overall economic growth, health, and dynamism. But again, I see Denver very well placed here as an east-west transition zone, obviously a very resource-rich area, very attractive from a climate standpoint as well. This is a similar rendition, stripping out everything else, but showing you just what could have been, a high-speed rail network across the U.S. I don't necessarily think we need it. Unlike other areas like Europe where you have dense high-speed rail, the United States is far, far larger. So I think the aviation industry and rehabilitating our airports is more important for the U.S. and that is something that's been going on. For 10, 15 years now, we've all complained about the quality of our airports, but believe it or not, it is something that has been improving gradually over time. And I think that having that market, regional airlines for transportation, freight, I would say for freight rail, this is extremely important. We have some inefficiencies in the movement of commodities, whether it's oil, gas, food, around the country, especially in the Great Lakes region. So we need to improve our freight rail transportation networks to ensure that we have this, again, optimization of our own geography. So now let's focus really on cities. What do cities have to do to be the most attractive places? So we talked about being connected to global supply chains, drawing in investment from around the world, drawing in talent as well. Now also, how do you attract people, especially young people? And one other background to this is what is happening again with demographics. It's not just the financial stress that millennials and Generation Z face as a result of the financial crisis of 10 years ago and the pandemic of today. It's also the fact that the world population is starting to level off and young people today are not having children. So in other words, unlike every other generation of the last 100,000 years, what is literally unique right now is that humankind is not creating a larger population than itself each generation. So this is a very strange world that we are heading into. What it means for right now, this very minute, is that if your city is not attracting millennials and Generation Z, so young people and their children, if they're having any, then you are actually going to wither economically in the next 10, 15 years. And we can see this happening, obviously, in some parts of the United States where populations have been depleting and moving away. And cities like Denver, however, have been attracting them. So what are the things you want to do to ensure a certain degree of resilience, right? Not only attracting talent, but building the kind of, sort of infrastructural framework that is attractive to young people and that is resilient to economic or environmental shocks. Because, of course, sadly, we continue to experience them across all domains. So one is obviously having as much alternative and renewable energy as possible, whether it is wind, solar, hydro. Another relates to food production, working on localized agriculture, hydroponics and aquaponics and so forth, having multimodal transportation, obviously, and I think that Denver is working on this as well. So the ride-sharing industry, maybe light rail, building the kinds of geographies or residential mixed-use commercial and residential kinds of districts so that you can have more of a what's called a half-mile lifestyle, relatively low rise. Obviously, having very good internet access and connectivity as well. These are the kinds of things that are attracting young people. Obviously, using digital technology, citizen dashboards, in order to ensure that people can have maximum awareness of what is happening in terms of governance, the services available to them, crisis management, and so forth. These are just some of the examples of things that cities need to do. There are many rankings of smart cities that you can find and read. They can go through hundreds of indicators, but I would try to boil it down to the 10 to 15 most important things that matter, and these are some of them. So getting cities right requires, first of all, that you have to anticipate housing and transportation demand. This is number one, because for most households around the world, the majority of their disposable income, or the largest components of their expenditures, are around housing and transportation. So thinking about having cities with multiple hubs, building enough housing to absorb growing populations, and having good quality transportation is absolutely critical. And this is one of the biggest differentiators between cities that are gaining people and those that are losing people. Another is the administrative alignment. And this is also very, when you have, cities with either Democratic town hall or city hall and a Republican representation in Congress or the Senate or the governor's house. It's nonetheless, no matter what the political alignment, having administrative alignment, a sense that there is coordination around the priorities of the state, the way in which resources are being allocated, and the ways in which cities benefit. What we see is that some cities really are desperate for more immigration and migrants, but of course, state or federal policy resists that. Or some cities want to move towards a grid parity, have more renewable energy, but the state is not regulating the utilities to encourage that. So we need to have that administrative alignment as well. Fiscal devolution, this is critical. It's important to make sure that cities have the money to spend on their local priorities, obviously, rather than money being controlled from the top. Locals tend to know best, and this is the principle of devolution in terms of how they should allocate money. And it is very important to support second-tier cities. What I could have mentioned earlier in that slide about global demographics is that so often, again, a country depends on just one city, or a state depends on one city. But if you imagine Colorado, Denver becoming more populous, you will, if you don't know it already, want to have more, centers of growth and activity and economic activity, and have them all connected and benefiting from each other. Otherwise, you'll have too much congestion into one area. Another is this economic master planning, strategic coordination. Now, a lot of people talk about master planning, and they mean, of course, architecture and design and urban planning. That's very important, of course, to have that, but there has to be the economic strategy, which is going back to the first point. What is the role of Denver? What is the role of Colorado? What is the role of other cities in the state in the global and national division of labor? What jobs do you intend to create? What industries do you want to attract? What investment are you trying to receive? How are your educational institutions training the next generation to be well prepared to take those jobs and to innovate? That is all part of economic master planning. And so often it's forgotten. And it's extremely complex exercise that has to take a 5-10-year horizon. It has to take into account so many things around the cost of labor, the pace of technological change, industrial policies, and so forth. But it is an extremely engaged process that every city, again, has to go through, because, again, every city is competing with every other city, both within the country and internationally. The final point I'll emphasize again is, again, connectivity, right? Connectivity is how we generate economic resilience, by allowing people to move to where they need to move, by allowing digital connectivity or supply chain connectivity, so that whether it's in a crisis situation like now or in the longer term, that we are able to access the resources that we need, that we are able to sell to high growth markets. Germany is a very good example. After the financial crisis 10 years ago, even though Germany is so embedded in European trade, they said, well, our neighbors are growing very slowly now. Let's shift our supply chains and let's start to export much more to Asian countries. And that's what they started to do. And that's why German exports remained high. So this is a very practical set of questions. And at a time, again, when we're going to have to rebuild in some ways the economic model around of the US, every city needs to start answering that question right now. What is our role? What's our economic role? What's our strategy? What cities do we need to be connected to? Who do we need to be drawing talent from and resources from? So a couple of more points just to emphasize around the environmental issues. Prior to the 20th century, the world could be described as an agropolis, right? There was more localized food production, less global food trade than we have today. Then came the 20th century age of the petropolis, where cheap energy allowed us to create these just-in-time supply chain models. And it sort of lulled us into the sense that, supply chains were seamless and frictionless in a thoroughly connected world. And of course, there's a lot of waste and carbon emissions and so forth associated with that. Now we're moving into this model, which some, in an aspirational sense, called the e-copolis, right? Where we think about localized energy production, consumption again, and the circular economy. And this is something that each city should strive towards. Building resilience, let me mention again, as cities get larger, Denver is not as large as Los Angeles, but if you were to reinvent Los Angeles or plan for the future Denver, you would say, well, we must absolutely distribute within the city and have more distributed neighborhoods that are each an industrial cluster. Let me give you an example from Singapore, where I live right now. This is perhaps the most densely populated country in the entire world. There's 5 million people on an island that you could cycle around in a couple of hours. And yet, in order to avoid urban core downtown congestion, they have created what they call towns. And they have clustered the clean tech park, the 3D printing and advanced manufacturing park, and the IT back office park in different parts of the island. And people have moved to live in those same geographies where they work, and they have much less commuting and there's much less congestion, despite the fact that this is a world financial center with a downtown with skyscrapers and lots of people moving around. There's almost no traffic in this country on this island as a result of distributing that activity. That is part of the economic master planning. It's also part of the spatial master planning as well that a city like Denver needs to go through. Again, emphasizing on climate change, we are, more for the worse than the better, obviously heading into a world where coastal areas may be increasingly inundated. And that's going to mean, obviously, that populations may be moving inward and resettling. So could Denver be a place that is going to, attract more climate migrants, if you will? And the answer is obviously yes. It's something to prepare for. Again, it's that question of latitude, altitude, and attitude. And this shows you some of the key geographies in the world. This is from National Geographic. We have over the last, 10,000 years become mostly a coastal urban civilization. And that is going to change. All right, let's be blunt about it. That is going to change. Many populations are going to move inland. The question is how far, and if they move, why move just a little? If the economic activity has changed considerably, why not think about new areas to settle, new industries to develop? And climate change is forcing us to do that, and a city like Denver can be front and center in that thinking. Another way of looking at what's happening is not looking at rising sea levels, but rather rising temperatures. And this is perhaps, I don't want to be fatalistic, but really one of the most arresting maps that I can show you. And it's a projection of what will happen to global agriculture if temperatures rise by 4 degrees Celsius. And what you see there is that unlike today, right now, the world's largest food producing countries are the United States, Brazil, India, China, and Australia. But increasingly, what you're seeing is that Canada and Russia are among the world's largest food producers. Kazakhstan is as well in terms of wheat and other crops. So now think about this from a demographic standpoint. The colors, the areas in green, which is again, the future of global agriculture supply, actually represent a tiny fraction of the global population, right? Less than maybe 100 to 200 million people out of 8 billion people. So we have a lot of adjustments to think about in terms of the shifting of supply chains, in terms of agriculture, industry, the movement of people. So the alignment really of our human geography, our political geography, our infrastructure, our economics, all of these things are quite misaligned right now. And whether it's the pandemic or whatever, or climate change, whatever comes next in terms of crises, they're constantly reminding us about this misalignment. And the places that are going to survive in this turbulent world are going to be the cities that have done the best job of planning ahead, not just for coping with the pandemic, but coping with economic shocks, climate shocks, and so forth. And that is, fundamentally my message. The world is going to continue to become more and more complex. But if you think about history from a 7,000, 10,000 year standpoint, it is the cities that have always survived. There are cities like Cairo or Alexandria, Baghdad, Damascus, Istanbul. These cities have a 5,000 or 6,000 year history. They have seen, empires rise and fall, countries come and go, borders shift, but the city is always there. So thinking about the role of your city in a globally connected world is, one of the most important considerations that you can make in terms of the strategy for your geography for the future. So again, I think that fortunately Denver is quite well placed in many of these ways, but nothing is going to land in our lap. We have to work very, very hard to navigate this complexity and ensure that Denver is not just the capital of the Rocky Mountains, but a world capital in the future. Thank you so much. And now I'm very happy to take your questions, so I'll respond to some that have come in just now. The first is to respond to those who think of the pandemic was caused by connectivity and connected supply chains. That's a very good point. The connected world is not all rosy. It really does accelerate in many ways the pace at which pandemics can spread. Even cyber hacking and viruses spread obviously through our internet connectivity. So there are pros and cons to a rapidly connected world. But remember that even in a world such as the 14th century, where we didn't have high-speed railways or airplanes, the plague still made its way across the Silk Roads, if you will, from east to west, from China to Europe, and killed tens of millions of people. So it's not about connectivity being to blame. It's about managing connectivity. It's what I call managing flow and friction. The flows are good. Flows of people, flows of goods, flows of technology, flows of money are good. But you want to have friction over flows of pandemics, flows of cyber viruses, flows of terrorists, things like that. So using technology, using filtering, using border control, using epidemiological data, these are all the tools that we have at our disposal to manage connectivity better. And each crisis that we have, quite frankly, does teach us how to manage it better. So remember that connectivity is not the cause of a pandemic. Connectivity is an enabler. It's the enabler of everything that is good, but it's also an enabler of some bad things as well. And I think that I genuinely believe we are getting better at managing the flow and the friction of that connectivity. The next question is about the impact of tariffs on changing supply chains. It's a very good question. Again, we've been moving towards a world where almost 95 or 99% really of the tariffs that existed in the early part of the 20th century have been removed. So we've got very close to a more or less frictionless global economic environment. That's why we have these far-flung supply chains. Tariffs obviously have some impact, but the cost differential of making something in an expensive country like Germany or America versus in Thailand is still absolutely enormous. So by and large, you still see countries or companies choosing to outsource to keep production costs cheap. Until we have rapid deployment of automation technology and very cheap energy inputs, and a very large market so that you're selling at huge scale. For categories of goods that tick those boxes, you could imagine that you could have a full cost-effective nearshoring. But remember, we also have global companies. American companies are global companies. Apple is an obvious example. Sure, 35 or 40% United States, but it would not be a $1 trillion company without that other 60% in the rest of the world. And if we have tariffs, other countries have tariffs. In fact, they have them already. So Chinese industrial policy is saying, if you want to sell an iPhone in China, you have to make it in China. So even if you could have a Foxconn factory in Texas, make every single Apple product in the whole world super cheap and super fast, suddenly you've got countries like China and India and others that will say, well, we're not going to buy your iPhones anymore, or we'll put tariffs on them because you didn't make them in our country anymore, and therefore it's going to cost a lot more. And of course, then Samsung is going to eat up the market share. Huawei is going to eat up the market share, right? As it is, Apple has less than 2% market share in China. So you don't want to disobey, if you will, the law of the supply chain too much. Let's take the question about projection of U.S. exports of natural gas and which countries will benefit. I think this is a great point. And as I mentioned in one of the slides, there is an effort to build more pipelines, Gulf Coast, Pacific Coast, Canada is doing the same thing. The North American energy exports certainly go to Europe now and to ease some of the countries' burden in terms of those that depend the most on Russian natural gas, for example, then obviously exports to China. Before the trade war, China had become the largest single national purchaser of American oil exports. And you think about that's a rapid change because it was only in 2015 that Congress lifted the ban on exporting American energy. And it took basically just a couple of years for China to say, we'll buy it all. So there's enormous energy trade, obviously, across the Pacific and across the Atlantic. So there are a lot of countries benefiting. But remember that oil and gas are global markets. So it isn't actually so much a direct sale from one country to the other than when there's long-term supply contracts that are locked in. It's more about increasing supply so that the global price goes down for everyone. And that is obviously bad for countries that are entirely dependent on oil exports, like a Saudi Arabia or Russia or Iran. But it's very good for most countries that need to have cheap energy imports so that they can lower their current account deficit and so that their companies can have a stable and cheap energy supply to invest and to produce. So India, for example, is the biggest beneficiary of cheap oil prices, as is China. Now, when those two countries benefit, that outweighs the pain that Saudi Arabia feels because Saudi Arabia only has 30 million people. So if you look at the big picture, cheap energy is a good thing. That's a great, great question. And it's very important because what is critical is to think about what I was calling the intermodality. To have an airport that's a freight and logistics hub that is connected to railways and high quality roads so that goods are delivered or in one place and then move outward from there. So being a high quality logistics hub is extremely important. Again, let me give you the example of, the port of Los Angeles is an obvious one. It's the busiest port, Long Beach port in the United States. Goods that come in there go obviously all over the entire West Coast, Western region of the United States. Right now, Miami and Charleston, Savannah are competing to be a critical port for servicing the southeast of the United States. So ports compete, or gateway cities and airports also compete to be the key distribution hubs. So having not only a high quality airport for goods, but then the delivery distribution mechanisms to other population centers is very, very critical. So again, so much can be done not just in terms of the infrastructure, but also the technology, anticipating the demand, optimizing and speeding up the distribution of goods. And this is all the role of technology and big data that can be applied to that infrastructure. And I think that that's most definitely something that Denver can invest more in. Well, let's take the question about China planning 25 years out, very strategic, and the U.S., less so. And obviously, Asia has gotten very good at this long-term planning with their infrastructure investments and supply chains. But to be honest, they're also very reactive as well. It's not just who plans ahead the longest, but who reacts the fastest, right? And I think that's something that is underestimated. So we need to be more resilient and responsive to threats or to new opportunities. I wouldn't necessarily give Asia too much credit, as much as I often do that. It's fairly obvious when you're a poor and developing country that you need to spend 20 years building high quality infrastructure, and that's what they've been doing, right? That you need to invest in the education of your people, that's what they've been doing. In building hospitals and in schools and roads, that's what they've been doing. In attracting the latest technology investment, that's what they've been doing. So I'm not going to advocate that we should be learning, a lot from Asia. What I would say, though, is that there's certain universal smart policies. Keep up your infrastructure. Keep training your population. Keep them educated in the latest skills and services economy areas. Have high quality internet broadband. Move towards mobile payments. These kinds of things. Ensure your environmental resilience and resilience of your food supply. These are things, investment and less on tax, right? One of the things that we have happening, is tax competition across states. But what matters more in the long run is investment, right? Tax can be fleeting, tax is volatile every year, but when you get companies and families to invest in your state, then they're going to stay for a while. So one of the cardinal rules in my thinking about political economy and how to be more competitive is to actually focus less on tax and much more on attracting investment. And that requires a long-term vision that you are offering to others to co-invest with you. And having that's a 20-year vision is as important as the money that you spend right now with a 20-year plan, getting others to buy into your 20-year plan. And I think that is something that a city can do, even if it doesn't have the fiscal capacity to say, we will be spending this much for the next 20 years. So, the American way, in terms of offering that vision is still just as strong as what you might call the Asian way of building and building and building.